Marcus Johnson had never imagined himself behind bars. At 16, his life revolved around school, volunteer work at the neighborhood library, and weekend basketball games. He had good grades, a loyal group of friends, and a mother who did everything to ensure he had a promising future. But that day, sitting in the courtroom, he felt for the first time the weight of something he couldn't control, the look of a judge who had already decided his fate before even hearing his defense. The air in the room seemed dense, laden with expectations and tensions that made no sense to him. All he could do was wait, while his lawyer, an overburdened public defender, tried, without much enthusiasm, to present evidence proving his innocence. Sarah Johnson, sitting in the first row, clutched her hands tightly, her fingers intertwined, as if trying to contain the anger and despair growing inside her. She knew her son. She knew he would never do anything like what he was being accused of. Moreover, the evidence was clear: security footage, witnesses, library records. But nothing seemed to matter. Judge William Harrison maintained an impassive expression, as if he had already heard it all before and was just waiting for his turn to speak. When he finally opened his mouth, his sentence fell like a harsh blow. 2 years in juvenile detention, no chance for early parole, no consideration for Marcus's impeccable alibi. Sarah felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. When the guards approached to handcuff Marcus, the courtroom seemed to spin. He heard his mother shouting his name, but his feet did not respond. It was as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping around his wrists was a cold shock against his skin. He tried to speak, tried to argue once more, but his voice failed him. The lawyer beside him averted his gaze, as if he had seen it all happen so many times that he no longer allowed himself to react. When the guards dragged him out, Marcus had only an instant to see his mother's face, her eyes brimming with pain and fury. He wanted to say he would be all right, that somehow this would be resolved, but not even he believed those words. The doors closed behind him, and suddenly everything became colder, heavier. The world he knew was gone. Sarah was paralyzed, as if time had frozen around her. The judge had already left the courtroom. Murmurs from the audience filled the space, but nothing made sense. 2 years. How was that possible? How could someone ignore so much evidence and destroy an innocent boy's life? Her stomach churned, a bitter taste rising in her throat. She suddenly stood up, eyes burning, and left the room almost without realizing where she was going. Outside, the air felt heavier than ever. Her son, the boy she had raised with so much effort and dedication, was being taken to a place where he didn't belong. Desperation threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She couldn't afford to collapse. Not now. Not while Marcus needed her. Marcus was placed in the back seat of a patrol car, the handcuffs still tight on his wrists. The vehicle started moving, but he didn't look outside. He didn't want to see the streets he had known his entire life, now becoming distant and unrecognizable. His heart pounded, and the only thing he could think was how it all made no sense. He wasn't a criminal. He had never had trouble with the law, had never been involved in anything wrong. What had he done to be there? The silence inside the car was suffocating, broken only by the engine's noise and the occasional crackle of the police radio. The guards said nothing. To them, he was just another one. When they finally arrived at the juvenile detention center, Marcus felt a knot in his throat. The building before him looked more like a fortress than anything else. Bars, high fences, walls worn by time. He took a deep breath, but the air felt heavy. 2 years. How was he going to survive 2 years in there? As he passed through the metal gates, Marcus noticed the stares on him. Other youths were in the yard, some chatting in small groups, others just watching. The environment was unlike anything he had ever known. It wasn't just the cold, impersonal structure of the place, but the energy in the air, a mix of suspicion and constant alert. A guard nudged him forward, indicating that he should keep walking. He was taken to a small room, where he received an orange uniform and an identification number. The entire process was quick, mechanical, without any consideration for the fact that he was innocent. No matter what he said, in there he was just another detainee. After passing through narrow, dimly lit corridors, he arrived at the cell he would share with another boy who didn't even glance his way when he entered. Marcus sat on the hard bed, feeling the thin, uncomfortable mattress beneath him. The reality of what had happened finally hit him full force. For the first time, he truly felt fear. The first night was a test of endurance. Marcus lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The cell was cold and damp, the smell of mold mingling with that of cheap disinfectant, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. The mattress was so thin, it felt like he was lying directly on the metal frame of the bed. But none of that was worse than the whirlwind of thoughts that wouldn't leave him in peace. How had it happened? How could someone be condemned even with indisputable evidence of their innocence? He tried to organize the facts in his mind, to find a rational explanation, but all he could feel was anger. Not his own, but anger at the system, at Judge Harrison, at the lawyer who seemed not to have made enough effort. He had never felt so powerless. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine that he was at home, in his own room, listening to the soft sound of the TV in the living room where his mother used to watch her shows at night. But the noise around him brought him back to reality. Muffled laughter, heavy footsteps in the corridor, the creaking of beds being adjusted, murmurs among the other inmates. Nothing there felt safe. Marcus turned to the side, trying to distance himself as much as possible from the cold wall, but the physical discomfort was the least of his problems. The real weight was in his mind. He knew that if he wanted to survive in there, he needed to stay in control. But how could one remain steadfast when everything had been taken from you so brutally? His cellmate hadn't said a word yet. He had merely turned to the other side and pulled the thin blanket over his head, as if accustomed to that routine. Marcus tried to do the same, but sleep did not come. Fear was an insistent visitor, whispering all the ways in which this experience could worsen. He didn't know anyone in there, didn't know how things worked, who he could or couldn't trust. All he knew was that, at that moment, he was completely alone. On the other side of town, Sarah Johnson did not sleep that night. After leaving the courtroom, she went straight home, but she couldn't sit down, couldn't rest. Her mind raced, trying to find a way, anything that could reverse that absurd sentence. She opened the folder where she kept all the case documents, spreading the papers across the kitchen table. The library records clearly showed that Marcus was there at the time of the crime. There were witnesses who could confirm his presence. The security camera footage proved that he had never been near the scene of the accusation. So why? Why was all of that ignored? Sarah got up and began pacing back and forth. The answer was obvious, yet still infuriating. Marcus was not condemned by the facts. He was condemned by prejudice. It was something she had always feared, but never imagined would happen to her own son. Since Marcus was little, Sarah had taught him to be polite, to work hard, to never give anyone a reason to think badly of him. But no matter how many precautions she took, the truth was that the system was not on his side. And now, he was paying the price for something he didn't do. But Sarah would not accept that. She couldn't. Her motherly, protective instinct screamed inside her. She needed to act. She grabbed the phone and began making calls. First to the public defender who had represented Marcus, but he was vague and evasive, saying he had done everything in his power. Then she reached out to friends, acquaintances, anyone who could help her understand how to appeal the sentence. But the more answers she sought, the more she realized it wouldn't be that simple. The system was like a high, cold wall built to discourage anyone from challenging it. Sarah spent the next hours immersed in articles, legal proceedings, and court records. Frustration grew with every document she read. There was a clear pattern, but it was ignored. Dozens of young black individuals had passed through Judge Harrison's court and received disproportionately harsh sentences. His name appeared repeatedly in questionable cases, where evidence was dismissed and testimonies were ignored. Sarah's anger transformed into determination. She knew that fighting against such an entrenched system would be a difficult battle, but if there was one thing she would never do, it was accept that her son pay for a crime he didn't commit. She decided she needed support. First, she contacted a local journalist, a reporter who had already investigated cases of judicial injustice. Then, she reached out to civil rights organizations. She knew that alone, her voice could be silenced, but if she could mobilize more people, perhaps she could expose the truth. The initial contacts were hesitant. Many already knew of Judge Harrison's reputation and understood that taking him down would require more than just outrage. But when Sarah presented the data, the numbers, the patterns of unjust convictions, the scenario changed. Marcus's case ceased to be just an isolated mistake. He was proof of a larger problem that needed to be confronted. On the other side of town, Emma Harrison was leafing through old files in the university library. Her academic project on racial disparities in the criminal justice system had led her to a name she knew well, William Harrison, her own father. At first, she thought it was a coincidence, an isolated case that ended up on the research radar. But as she analyzed more cases, patterns began to emerge. Longer sentences, convictions without concrete evidence, black defendants having fewer chances for parole, all of this within the court presided over by her father. Emma tried to dismiss the unsettling idea that this might mean something bigger. She had always seen her father as a strict but fair man. He was an upholder of the law, someone who had spent his life imposing order. But what if that order was distorted? A sense of unease took hold of her. Marcus Johnson's name appeared several times in recent documents. The case was shocking. The boy had indisputable evidence of his innocence, yet he was still convicted. Emma felt a tightness in her chest. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of something much larger. For the first time, she began to question the very upbringing, the values she had always taken for granted. She decided she needed to know more. In the silence of the library, surrounded by stacks of legal files, she realized she was facing a difficult choice. Ignore what she had discovered or confront the truth, even if it meant turning against her own father. Inside the detention center, Marcus began to understand the unspoken rules of that place. No one asked why you were there. It didn't matter whether you were guilty or innocent. What mattered was how you adapted. He spent the first days in silence, observing. He noticed that some boys always hung out together in small groups. Others preferred to remain isolated, avoiding any kind of contact. He didn't know where he fit in. He kept his head down, spoke only when necessary, and tried to follow instructions without drawing attention. But the tension never disappeared. There was always the fear of the unexpected, of the moment when someone would decide to test him. The worst, however, was the time. The clock seemed to move more slowly in there. Hours dragged by between tasteless meals, mandatory activities, and long waits. He missed everything. The freedom to walk the streets, the smell of the coffee his mother made every morning, the sound of friends playing basketball on the court. At night, the silence of the cell suffocated him. He wondered how many other boys in there were living the same injustice. How many had been thrown into that place without a real chance to defend themselves. But above all, he wondered how long it would take for someone to truly see him, for someone to realize that he shouldn't be there. While Marcus tried to adapt to the cruel rhythm of juvenile detention, Sarah intensified her fight. With the help of the local journalist, the story began circulating in small reports, first in blogs and community newspapers, then on local radio. Marcus's case was not just about him. It was a reflection of something larger, a system that seemed to have different rules depending on the defendant's skin color. Sarah began receiving messages from other families who had faced similar injustices. Mothers who saw their children convicted without evidence, who tried to fight back and were ignored. The indignation began to grow. Marcus's case was becoming more than an unjust sentence. He was a symbol of something that needed to change. It was then that the story reached social media. An influential civil rights activist shared the case, raising questions about Judge Harrison's history of sentencing. In just a few hours, thousands of people were commenting, asking how a boy with such clear evidence of his innocence could be convicted. The pressure began to mount. Sarah realized that this was the right moment to act. She contacted lawyers specializing in sentence reviews, seeking a way to appeal. For the first time since that day in the courtroom, she felt that there might be a real chance to bring her son back home. The repercussion of Marcus's case reached a new level when major media outlets began covering the story. Television programs and news websites started questioning Judge Harrison's impartiality, highlighting the racial disparity in the sentences he imposed. In just a few days, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Protests began to appear in front of the courthouse, with placards demanding justice for Marcus and for so many other youths unjustly convicted. Renowned lawyers volunteered to review the case, and civil rights groups pressured the system to re-evaluate the judge's decisions. Marcus Johnson's name now symbolized something far greater than his own struggle. Inside detention, Marcus only became aware of the movement's scale when one of the guards made a sarcastic remark. "Seems like you've become famous out there." With no access to the internet or television, he could only catch fragments of information from the few newspapers circulating among the inmates. But he noticed that something was different. Some staff looked at him with less disdain, and even other detainees began to show him silent respect. Deep down, he wanted to believe that all of this meant a chance to leave that place, but he was also afraid of being misled. He learned in a short time that too much hope could be dangerous. The public pressure only increased, and the court could no longer ignore the growing demand for justice. Sarah, who had been immersed in documents and emails for days, was finally summoned to a review hearing. It was the decisive moment. She prepared as never before, gathering all the evidence she had and counting on the support of lawyers and activists who had joined the cause. During the hearing, Sarah's lawyer once again presented the security footage, the witness testimonies, the library records, and the simple truth that Marcus was elsewhere at the time of the crime. But what really made the difference was the weight of the evidence regarding the pattern of racial discrimination in Judge Harrison's sentencing. That was when Emma Harrison, the judge's daughter, stepped in. She had decided to take a stand, not as the judge's daughter anymore, but as a citizen who believed in the justice system and equality for all. She was no longer willing to watch what was happening and remain silent. With a heavy heart, she appeared before the Judicial Review Commission and delivered indisputable evidence that her father, in his position, had sentenced black defendants disproportionately and unjustly. Her speech, clear and resolute, shook the room. Emma knew she was doing something that could change the course of her own life, but she was ready to face the consequences. Emma's revelation had a devastating impact. In that moment, the court had no choice. Judge Harrison, with all his authority and reputation, saw his credibility publicly and irreversibly questioned. The evidence presented by Emma, combined with the growing support from civil rights groups, led the Review Commission to decide to re-evaluate not only Marcus's case, but also previous cases presided over by Harrison. In an unprecedented move, the judge was removed from his duties until a deeper investigation could be conducted. That was enough to spark a wave of mobilization among lawyers and human rights advocates, who pressed even harder for all sentences of black defendants under the judge's jurisdiction to be reviewed. Marcus, however, still did not know that his release was near. Those changes in the court would take a little longer to reflect in his case. He spent more days in detention, his anxiety growing with every piece of news. On one hand, he felt a slight hope, but on the other, the fear that injustice might swallow him up again. Even with everything happening outside that place, within the walls of the detention center, he was still just a number. He was trapped in a limbo, not knowing whether tomorrow would bring a chance or another day of despair. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The movement in favor of Marcus gained strength, and the media kept covering the case. The public pressure was finally enough to accelerate the review of Marcus's case. When the notice reached Sarah that the case would be reopened, she couldn't believe it. She had spent the previous night awake, reviewing every document, every detail. She knew this was her last chance. When Judge Harrison was removed and replaced by another magistrate, the feeling that justice was finally being served was like a relief. But the fear that there were still more obstacles to face did not let her feel completely at ease. Marcus, still at the detention center, received the news of his release in the morning. He remained silent for a few moments, unsure if what he was hearing was real. The guard, who until then had always seemed indifferent, looked at him and said, "You're getting out today." It wasn't a tone of sympathy, but for the first time, Marcus felt that something was moving in his favor. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he felt a strange warmth, a sensation of freedom that had previously seemed distant. When he was finally led to the exit, Marcus saw his mother waiting for him on the other side of the gate. Sarah couldn't hide her tears, but at the same time, there was a smile of relief on her face. She had won a battle, but she knew that the fight for justice was far from over. Marcus's release was a milestone, not only for him and his mother, but for the entire community. When he left the detention center and was received by Sarah, the streets seemed different, as if charged with a new hope. They didn't speak much on the way home, but Sarah's hand gripped Marcus's, and he knew that in that gesture lay years of struggle, pain, and perseverance. Although the release had been a victory, they both knew that the system that had put them in that place was still there. Injustice does not disappear just because Marcus is free. His case had shed light on the structural and racial flaws within the judicial system, yet there was still much to be done. Meanwhile, society began to feel the effects of the mobilization surrounding the case. Emma's impact in having decided to oppose her father sparked a public debate about the role of judges in the justice system and the effect of racial inequalities on sentencing. The media and social networks kept discussing the case, and civil rights organizations were uniting to push for a broader judicial reform. The change that Marcus and his mother had begun seemed to be growing. Sarah and other racial justice advocates continued to press for the review of sentences for other defendants who had been convicted under Judge Harrison's regime. The movement in favor of reviewing sentences gained momentum, with organized groups and civil rights activists pressing for a reform in the judicial system. Marcus's case was just the beginning of a wave that started to change how the system dealt with racial issues in its practices. Judge Harrison, removed from his duties, became the main target of a deeper investigation into his decisions over the years. His mistakes, now exposed, were beginning to be questioned by the very judicial institution of which he was a part. Although change was slow, it was underway. Marcus, now at home, had a brief moment of peace. But the feeling of relief was soon replaced by the pressure of trying to rebuild his life. The injustice he had suffered could not be erased, and he knew it wouldn't be easy to start believing in the same society that had put him behind bars for no reason. His mother's support was crucial at this moment. Sarah, despite her exhaustion, remained his pillar, showing him that despite everything that had happened, there was still room to rebuild the future. He would go back to studying, reconnect with his friends, live again. But the journey would be long and difficult. The impact of the public pressure and popular mobilization soon began to reflect in concrete changes. The review of Marcus's sentence and that of other defendants convicted for similar reasons started to be implemented, albeit slowly. The judicial system was being forced to re-evaluate itself, to honestly examine its flaws. The review commissions began to work in a more detailed manner, assessing past cases and making decisions that were once unthinkable. The changes were still in their infancy, but the direction was clear. A reform was necessary for the system to rebuild with more impartiality. Although relieved by his release, Marcus knew he wouldn't be the only one to benefit. Other stories like his, of young black individuals being unjustly convicted, also needed attention. He now understood that his experience was not unique. It was part of a vicious cycle that needed to be broken. There was still much to be done. In the following months, he began to get involved in community activities, trying to give back, in some way, the help he had received. He knew his case had been an exception amidst so many injustices, and that for real change to occur, the fight had to continue. Marcus's freedom was not a simple return to his old life. He encountered difficulties in many aspects, especially dealing with the stigma of having been unjustly imprisoned. The weight of the sentence still followed him, like a shadow that refused to disappear. He knew that the scars from that ordeal would not heal overnight. However, over time, he began to realize that his freedom was also a new opportunity, a chance to start over. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could build something different from that point on. His mother, Sarah, also faced the process of rebuilding. The battle to prove Marcus's innocence and fight against the system's injustices had been exhausting. But seeing him back, she knew they had gained more than just her son's freedom. They had proven that with perseverance and unity, even the greatest adversities could be challenged. Yet Sarah knew that the work was far from over. She would continue her fight, now with Marcus by her side, so that victims of injustices like his could have a chance. The system, even in transformation, still needed much change. Time passed and the changes began to manifest more concretely. Marcus's case became an example of how mobilization and resistance could make a difference. In various parts of the country, other cases began to be re-evaluated, and racial disparities in the judicial system received the attention they had always deserved. More voices rose, more people united for the cause, and the movement for a fairer reform started gaining strength. Sarah and Marcus participated in conferences and events, not just to share their story, but to continue pressing for significant changes. The fight was not confined to the past, it extended into the future. Marcus's life, though still in recovery, took on a renewed purpose. He continued his studies, but now with a different focus. Instead of merely seeking a career, he wanted to make a difference. He wanted to use his experience to help others avoid the same mistake. The pain he carried was still there, but he knew it did not define him. He was building something larger than himself, a chance for other lives to be spared from the same cruel fate. Change, even if small, was happening. The future now seemed brighter, but he knew that the path to full justice would still be long. The change that Marcus and his mother had long sought did not come without sacrifices. They faced more challenges, more obstacles, but the transformation underway was impossible to ignore. The judicial system, still far from perfect, was beginning to reflect the fruits of so many people's struggles. For Marcus, the deepest lesson was not about what he had lost or suffered, but about the power of taking action in the name of justice, never allowing fear or pain to overshadow the desire to change the world around him. He understood that, flawed as the system might be, he and his mother had become part of the solution, not merely victims of the problem. Sarah, for her part, continued her journey with a lighter heart yet a fighting spirit. She knew that despite the victories achieved, the work would never end. There were more lives to be touched, more cases of injustice to be challenged. Marcus's case, and the mobilization it sparked, became a part of history, a reminder that even in the face of pain, it is possible to build something meaningful. She looked at her now adult son and knew that together they had changed the course of many lives, including their own. The legacy of her fight for justice would be eternal.